Here is a brown ink by Aurora Sepia. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook. I do enjoy those brown inks, especially the sepia. Now, this isn't my favorite of them, but if I were the kind of guy that did top 10 rankings, then this would be on that list. Generally, this is very consistent in tones. That's right, tones, because it shades really well all of the time. There's so much here for me to enjoy. I don't normally buy bottles without first sampling it, but I needed a bottle for the bottle segment, so I chose the sepia. So happy that I have this entire bottle to use up, and I'm going to enjoy every bit of it. Can you tell I like it? The pen for today is a Noodler's Neponset. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the soft fine nib, beautiful light. Really, when I say light, it's because I'm looking at all of them. It's the lightest tone we're gonna get. I don't see any kind of red leaning going on in the writing, despite the fact of what you'll see in the chromatography. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does shade incredibly well. Really consistent in its shading, constantly in and out of darker and lighter tones. It doesn't stay at one tone for very long. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. It does not feather. It does not spread. The brown on this paper it's perfect. It's really, if I was making a top 10, it would make it. It shades, yes. It shades much better than it did in the soft fine. Still really consistent. It barely ever holds two letters at the same tone. It shades so well. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the wet fine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It doesn't shade as well as it did on the wet fine, but it still shades really well. Now, the reason I'm going to say that it does not shade as well is look at the first word, the. The entire word is dark. Same picks up the shading, the, explanation, all of it then starts picking up into shading. That first word, but if you go to the third line, you see grandfather, the G, two tones, R, two tones in an R. It's that good. Looking at the broad nib, it is a bit lighter than it was with the medium, right about the same tone as it was with the soft fine. It does not feather, does not spread. It shades like a beast constantly throughout all of what's going on. This looks absolutely amazing with this broad nib. Its flow is really just perfect to bring out all of the best aspects that this ink has to offer. It's doing it so well. The whole review is going to be like this because I really like this ink. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and have no problems. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering. We get no spread. We do get shading, though not as much shading as we got in the Clairfontaine. That should be expected considering the paper. I still think it's shading incredibly well. I do wish it did it a little bit more here, but the paper's not made for fountain pens, and I'm just asking for the impossible from this impossibly great ink. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine. It is the same tone as it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It still shades very well. People want non-fountain pen paper that's a little better price-wise. I think this paper's it. This ink on this paper, fantastic. I love this. I love this ink, but I love brown inks. Looking at the medium nib, it is right about the same tone as it was with the wet fine, right about the same tone as it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, it does shade, it does look very good. It does make me very happy that I have a bottle of this. I am enjoying it far too much, really. Looking at the broad nib, it is a tiny bit lighter than it was with the medium. Same tone as the Clairfontaine, which puts it a bit darker than what we had on the soft fine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading, though I will say it is not shading as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It shades just a little bit less. But again, it's still doing a really good job. The amount of shading I'm seeing here, quite frequently, we would just call good shading if it was fountain pen friendly paper, but this isn't. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, because this ink is bottled awesome.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it's the same darkness as we had on the Clairfontaine, but the yellow tone of the paper is bringing out the red undertones that were seen in the chromatography. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is shading, though the shading that's happening is not as good as it was on the other papers. Not a surprise with my experience with this paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. It is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It is also a little bit more of that red really showing through here. Looks like a dark red to brown as a tone. With no feathering, with no spread, with minor shading as it happens, and it's really minor. You see it in father, you see it a little bit in he and was, not tons of shading coming through here. The absorbency of the paper is working against it. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine, quite a bit lighter in tone than it was on the Clairefontaine, and still very much coming through as more of a very red-leaning brown, with minor feathering that's happening on the G of everything. You see on the third line, the H of the, right before goblins, it'll be there. Minor feathering, no spread happening. There's moments where it shades, not really shading. The absorbency of the paper is overpowering the shading ability of this ink. Looking at the broad nib, it is darker, lighter. Lighter is the word I was looking for. A bit lighter than we had with the medium. Quite a bit lighter as a tone than we had on the Clairefontaine. And very much looking like a red more than a brown. Now, it's not feathering. It is not spreading. It is not shading. It is not a brown here. It loses everything that is so good about this ink, not just with this nib, but on this paper. The yellow tone and absorbency of this paper has taken most of what's great about this ink away. Looking at the back of the page, you see there is some light ghosting going on. Nothing bleeds through and touches the page, even though on the medium and the broad, you see that it does get deeper into the paper.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft, fine nib, we get just a tiniest bit. It's like one tone darker if you were looking at the total grayscale. Barely darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It is shading. I'm going to say just about as well as it did on the Clairefontaine. It is shading very well. I think it's the quad rule that really kind of makes some of the shading not show through as well as it could. I wish they made all of this stuff as completely blank pages. Looking at the wet fine nib, quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairefontaine, with no feathers, with no spread, with shading, yes. However, a great deal of what we're seeing is the darker tones, and when it is lightening up, it's lighting to a darker side of mid-tone, so the shading is not showing through as well as it did on the Clairefontaine. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, a little bit lighter than what we had on the Clairefontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade just as well as it did on the Clairefontaine, really not spending two letters at the same tone. This ink is always in transient from a mid to a dark or a mid to a dark, and constantly with the right nib. But I'm not a Rhodia fanboy. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the medium nib. It is right about the same tone that we had on the Clairefontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does not shade as well as it did on the Clairefontaine, even though it is shading pretty well. Look at the word turning. First word, you see it shift in and out of tones quite a bit. It's even suddenly constantly shifts in tones. Just the tone shift isn't as wide as it was on the Clairefontaine. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Califolio Sepia. Here is Diamine Sepia. Here is Papier Plume Sepia. Here is Pilot Mixable Sepia. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same darkness that we had on the Clairfontaine, but we get a little bit more of that red showing through in its undertones. Now, it is not feathering, it is not spreading, it is shading very well, which I'm going to say it every time that I very much appreciate it when that happens on this paper. Really not made for fountain pens, but boy, oh boy, does it do well. I think this shading here would look great in student notes. I'd probably bump a student a letter just for having notes that look this good. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. Right about the same tone as it is on the Clairfontaine. Slightly muted, with no feather, with no spread, with shading that does bring positive attention to everything you've written. So when you write things in these lab notebooks and you want everyone to take notice of it, this ink is a great way to do it. Other than the fact that they're going to be distracted by how beautiful the ink is and say, what ink were you using? Because your notes are one thing, but I really want to know about the ink. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine. It is a bit lighter than what we got on the Clairfontaine. Little duller, a little bit more red leaning. No feather, no spread. It does shade, but nowhere near as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. None of that should be any kind of a surprise with this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is right about the same tone that we had with the medium and the wet fine here. Bit lighter than we have on the Clairfontaine and a bit more red leaning, with no feather, with no spread, with tiny bits of shading throughout. I don't think this is the way to go with this ink. There's been a couple of papers that the broad has just not worked out well, and this is one of them. Looking at the back of the page, you see that ghosting is minimal. There's really none of it. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is Levenger Pinkley. Here is KWZ Iron Gall Green No. 3. Here is Robert Oster Red Orange. Here is Ackerman, their No. 7 Queen's Night Blue. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get basically the same tones that we had with the Clairfontaine paper. We have feathering, yes, of course, it's copy paper. We have some spread, yes, of course, it's copy paper. We have some shading, which is a danger sign for copy paper, makes me worry about bleeding later on. But I do think you could use this with a soft fine without major catastrophe. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. It is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Also, we're seeing a little bit of that red lean going on here from this paper, something we've really seen with the more inexpensively produced papers. It does feather quite a bit more than it did with the soft fine. It does spread to almost a broad. It does not shade, which I guess we'll call a good thing considering it's copy paper. Looking at the medium nib, the same tone as the wet fine. A bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Really looks like a dull red here, though, to me, as a color on the paper. Now, it does feather, not as bad as the wet fine. It does spread, not as bad as the wet fine, spreading to about a broad. It does have a couple of moments that are darker that I'm going to call shade, but I'm going to predict bleeding. Looking at the broad nib, it is right about the same tone as the medium and the wet fine. Lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, really showing off those red undertones. If you wanted this to be a red ink, of course, you would be missing out on all the great goodness that is this ink as a brown. Does it feather? Yes, of course. Don't be ridiculous. Does it spread? Of course. Don't be ridiculous. Does it shade? No, it doesn't. So it's got something good going on its side. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that it was a couple of spots with the medium, but only with the medium nib that it bled through. It did not bleed through with the wet fine, where I was really expecting it to have some issues. See the back of the page, plenty of ghosting. You can't write back here, but it didn't bleed, and that's the real upside of what's going on. Few spots with that medium, though.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
Dealer's choice. What isn't seen currently is that it's not seen in the review, but I have 5 different pens outside of this review inked up with this ink. I just kept wanting to see it in more, and I was loving it each time. So again, this is a dealer's choice, and I choose all of them.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching.